So the Yamaha EAD50 is an absolutely crazy tool for recording drums. In this video, I'm going to do a deep dive / breakdown of all of its various functions, as well as detailed tutorials on how to set this all up yourself. For my setup in this video, I'm playing my new Premier Artist 20-inch kit that I currently have a set of budget low volume cymbals on by Gear for Music. However, in the later sections of this video, I am also going to switch over to recordings that use regular full volume cymbals. I'm using the included DSU50 mic, but also because I'm using those low volume cymbals, I've also added a single Rode NT1A condenser microphone, which is acting kind of like a mono overhead. I'm using the built-in kick trigger from the DSU50, but I've also added 3 separate triggers to my setup so that I can have a trigger for the snare, my rack tom, and a floor tom. With all that said, I'm going to get into the basic setup of the module and what you might like to do with it when you first sit down with one at your own kit. I've loaded up the default scene, which is called Venue. So to give you an idea of what this sounds like out of the box without any additional triggers or mics. But what I'm actually going to do is kind of revert this all to a more basic default state and then start adding things to it gradually. So I'm going to turn off all the effects, I'm going to turn off all the reverb and turn off the kick trigger, and let's just start going through it bit by bit. The first thing I'm going to do is set the input gain for my DSU50 mic, and if I hit the mic button in the bottom left and go to the mic mixer section with this rotary knob, I can actually select between 2 different controls for the mic. I can select the gain and the volume. So this is the first thing you're probably going to want to adjust, is the input gain of the DSU50. Alright, so that's now horribly distorted, so I want to take that down a little bit. So you can set your input gain and then use the volume control to actually attenuate or set that level of that mic in your balance where you want it. I'm going to set it to about 80 there, so. Something else that we can do, because this DSU50 mic is literally mounted to the kick, sometimes that can create a bit of an unpleasant boxiness or kind of like that basketball kind of nasty mid-range frequency in there. So we can actually EQ that out on the mic with some onboard EQ. So if we hit the mic trig button, go to setting, go into the mic menu, and then scroll down to mic EQ, then make sure we've got mic 1 selected, which by default will be linked to channel 2, so that anything we do on this mic 1 menu will also be reflected on channel 2 here, because that's the right channel of the DSU50. Then what I'm going to do is scroll down to this low frequency band here, and then I'm going to take the gain and just boost it up. And then I'm just going to sweep through the frequencies. So you can hear down here, when I get down to 50 Hertz, that actually adds quite a nice thump to the bass drum. So I might leave a little bit of that in. But then if I scroll down to this mid-low band and then boost that up, I'm going to use this band to basically create a bell notch in my mid-range EQ. So you can hear it's right around that 315 Hertz, that kind of sort of sound. So we can just remove that. Tweak that to get a slightly tighter kick sound. Basically, at the moment, with this in isolation, you can hear I'm picking up these cymbals okay. and this mic's doing quite an impressive job of picking up this whole kit in stereo. However, what I have been finding is when I'm dropping this recording into a full mix, because I'm using low volume cymbals, I'm not picking those up as much. So I've actually got a Rode NT1A condenser microphone set up here as just kind of like a general overhead room mic kind of situation. I've got that coming in on input 3 on the back here of the EAD50. So there's 5 mic inputs. So I could also, for example, add an under snare mic or another pair of rim mics or an overhead. Kind of got a couple of options there, which is pretty cool. Now I'm at the point where I want to start adding my triggers in. So I'm going to start with the kick trigger. So if I want to start messing around with that kick trigger sound, I go into the mic trigger menu, go into setting, kit menu, and then inst again. And there are some okay ones in here. I quite like this maple one. But what is really cool about the Yamaha EAD50 is the fact that you can import custom samples onto this via an SD card, which I have done. So I'm going to import one of my own triggers that I've made using Addictive Drums 2. Now importing my custom sample for my kick trigger. I'm going to add in the snare trigger now. I'm actually going to replace that snare trigger with my own one again. I think that's sounding a lot better. Let's turn up the tom trig. By default, my floor tom trigger for some reason thinks it's a hi-hat. So to fix that, I'm going to go into the mic trigger options, go back into the inst menu, and yeah, you can see it thinks it's a hi-hat, so I'm going to change that. Another thing that's important to adjust in the trigger settings to make sure that you have a nice time if you're using the triggers. If I go to my kick trigger, and if I scroll down within this menu, you've got a few options here to adjust the sensitivity of the trigger and how it behaves. I pretty much want the kick drum to trigger every time I hit the bass drum. And if you've got your trigger gain set too low, you basically have to play really hard to get that trigger to play, which I don't want. I want it to be a bit more sensitive. So I'm going to turn up the gain for the trigger of that kick drum. So now it triggers much more reliably. However, the thing with that is there's another setting in this menu called sensitivity. And by default, I think this is jacked up pretty high. And the trouble with that is, so can you hear that having the sensitivity there, because I've got my gain up really high on that, because I want to make sure that basically every time I hit that tom, there's definitely a trigger happening behind it. But you can hear, because the sensitivity is really high, it's playing like several tom notes in a line. So if I turn down the sensitivity, so that's how you kind of get rid of that. And I've basically made sure of that on every single trigger. Set the gain high to make sure that you always get a trigger detected, and then set the sensitivity low so it doesn't flam, but so they're not so sensitive that they get triggered by you hitting other drums. For example, you don't want hitting the rack tom to also trigger the floor tom, so you need to get the sensitivities adjusted right. Takes a little bit of fiddling and tweaking, but not too long to get everything set up. And we could start adding reverb to that if we wanted to. So what else have we got in here? Got some master compression, which might be cool. Also, something I like to do is maybe add a bit of like a drive effect or a saturation. So I'm going to use this modifier 6 here. The category that I'm going to go for is amp simulator. So if I drive that up, so that's all pretty fun and pretty sick that that's all just readily available on the module. Some of the other features you've got on here which are all quite useful, obviously the built-in Metronome click track. Quite easy to start adjusting this. You can turn on this little human voice Counterpoint. And of course, if you didn't want to be sending that click out of the main outputs and just your headphones, you can easily do that in the click out menu. Simply just turn that off on the main out. And you could also easily route that click track out of an individual output here. So you could send it out to the rest of your band and send them all the same click track, so you could control that for your band. Also in here, you've got a built-in recorder, and it will save it all to, if you've got a USB stick plugged in, you can save that all to a USB thumb drive. But if I double tap the recorder button, that takes me to a looper. And I think this is actually really cool that this is built into here, because you can loop up a drum groove live, for example. Imagine it takes a bit of setup to get that to work smoothly, but the fact that you can do that so easily, just quickly loop up a drum groove, is, I think, really cool for live performance. The problem I've been having with the built-in looper in the EAD50 is the fact that just by default, it's not connected over MIDI, and so the looper is basically loose. It's not sticking to any kind of BPM value. If I try to loop something on the EAD50 without that kind of MIDI sync, then no matter how tight it sounds like I've got it initially, that loop will always end up drifting out of time with a click track. And that's not very helpful if I want to use that live looping feature in a performance with a live band, or looping other stuff like guitar over it and things like that. So to try and solve this problem, I've connected to the EAD50 over USB so that I can send it MIDI clock information from Ableton. I've successfully managed to get the EAD50 working as the slave device. So basically I can do things like start the transport in Ableton, and that will start triggering the click track in the EAD50 at the same time. So the EAD50 is definitely receiving MIDI information, and it is being controlled by Ableton. However, for the absolute life of me, I just cannot get the onboard looper on the EAD50 to sort of snap to the grid values in Ableton and actually make it quantize its start and stop loop point. So what I'm doing instead is using Ableton's looper on all of my EAD50 signals that are coming in as a group, and then that way I can actually loop up drums from the EAD50 and have them stay in time with the click from Ableton. And then that also means that I can loop up anything else that I might be running through Ableton, for example my guitar, and I think that's really, really powerful. So now that I've got the EAD50, it allows me to do performances like the one I'm about to show you. I thought I'd do a cover of one of my favourite tracks called Electric Counterpoint 3 by Steve Reich, and I'm going to start by looping up the guitar and then gradually bring in the drums and then loop those up, and then that allows me to mess with other synths and stuff whilst the drums are playing. It's kind of cool for live performance, I think, and I will show you a bit of that now. Also in this recorder section, you have also got a sampler, which I'm guessing would be for like sampling your kit that way, so that's kind of cool. But the other really useful things that this has got in it, I think, is the Bluetooth connectivity. So with this we can easily connect a phone or a laptop or tablet, for example, and then you can easily just stream audio to it. I've got my laptop and I'm just going to connect it to the EAD50 over Bluetooth like that. There we go, it is now connected. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my Samply account, and in here I've got a load of versions of my own tracks that I've created that have no drums but a click track baked into them, so that I can practice them just like this basically. So I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to play that from Samply, and that should now be, there we go. So you can hear that's now coming through my headphones, and I can easily set the balance of that with the audio slider here, and then I can just start playing along to my own tunes. So that's pretty ridiculously useful. That's some of the basic setup of this stuff. Now I'm going to talk about some of the different recording methods, but I think the main one that people are going to be excited about is the USB audio interface feature. So I'm going to cover that first and talk about how that works. When it comes to using this as a USB audio interface, something important to be aware of, whilst there are two USB ports on the back of this, it's only the USB-C port that you can use as a USB audio interface. If you try to connect a cable to the USB-A port and connect that to your laptop or computer, then the EAD is not going to be recognisable as a USB audio interface. However, what you can do is you can get a USB-C to A cable and plug the USB-C end into the EAD, and then you can connect that other end to a USB hub and plug that into a laptop. Good news is that this is extremely easy to set up. You don't need to download or install any drivers or software. It's literally just a plug and play situation. So you plug it in, and then it will be recognizable as an interface in your DAW, which you can see here I've got EAD selected. Something that you need to do on the module before this actually is to go into the menu setting and the USB audio menu and make sure that its mode is set to 8 in, 10 out. I think by default this is set to 2 in, 2 out. Just make sure that you've done that first. By default, mine is recording at 44.1 kilohertz, but I do have it at 24-bit depth. And you can see that if I was to try and change that in Logic, you can see that the others are all in italics, so I'm guessing that means that those are disabled. So I've created this little recording template here. This is basically what I want to try and get out of the Yamaha EAD50, and this is what I want to record from it, which I think is going to be a fairly typical setup that a lot of people are going to want to be able to do. So I want to be able to record the DSU50 stereo mic onto its own stereo track, my Rode NT1A room mic also onto its own track. Of course, I want to be able to record my kick trigger, my snare trig, and the rack toms. I also want to be able to record the distortion effects that I was showing you onto its own separate track, and I also want to get anything that I might be playing to, like a backing track from my phone or streaming over Bluetooth audio, also recorded in here alongside the drums. So how would you achieve that routing setup on the Yamaha EAD50 and in Logic? Okay, so this part is super important, and I imagine that this is where a lot of first-time users with the EAD50 are going to get tripped up and confused. So if I want to select my DSU50 stereo mic in Logic to record it from the EAD50, if I go into this and I select input 1 and 2, I'm not selecting inputs 1 and 2 on the back where that mic is plugged in, which I think is a little bit misleading, and you might think that that is what you're selecting when you're selecting from these input lists. So the really important thing to understand is by default, or I think just generally, inputs 1 and 2 are actually the main left and right out of the whole sum of the Yamaha EAD50. So if you select inputs 1 and 2, these are reserved for the sum. And that means that if you've got reverb effects up or distortion or the click track and you haven't set individual output routings for those, that's all going to come out of inputs 1 and 2. And without realizing that that's what's going on, you could accidentally end up in situations where you're recording duplicates of your audio that you're sending out to an individual output, but it could also end up coming through on here. For example, the reverb on the Yamaha EAD50, that was up, I might accidentally end up recording that in along with the DSU50 mic and not being able to change that afterwards in post, and that's kind of something to be aware of. If we want the DSU50 to be isolated on its own track, we'll actually have to route that so that it comes in on a different pair of inputs, for example inputs 3 and 4. So that's something to be aware of. And the way that that looks on the module is a bit confusing. So officially the EAD50 has 10 channels that we can record with it. However, because those first 2 channels are just reserved for the main left and right out, that may mean in certain situations we've only got 8 individual outputs that we can use, or we need to be a little bit clever about how we're using those main outputs 1 and 2 so that we can maximize the amount that we can get recorded out of this separately. And the way that works, if I go to the mic and I go to the mic out section and I scroll down to this individual out. So this indiv out is how we determine which things we want to route out of separate outputs. But if you leave the setting to off, just think of off as meaning 1 and 2. So this is the slightly confusing thing. When I select individual outs L1 and R2, that's actually going to make this mic turn up on inputs 3 and 4 in the DAW. Not entirely clear when you first start using this, and it kind of might have you going like, what the fuck's going on? I'm now going to route to my Rode NT1A mic to input 5. Go to the mic trig options for that. Go to mic out. Here I'm going to select individual out. And this is the tricksy thing. So, of course, L1 and R2 is actually inputs 3 and 4. And because I want this to come out in mono, not stereo, I'm going to scroll over here to where I get to the individual mono outputs. And I'm going to select L3 for my Rode mic, which is going to make that turn up on input 5. So give that a tap. Yeah, you can see that now my Rode NT1A mic is coming in on its own channel. So now let's do the kick trigger. I'm going to go to the mic trig menu setting. So I actually have to go to the kit menu, inst, and then inst out. So my overhead mic's set to L3. So my kick trigger needs to be on R4. And then that will make that turn up on input 6. Yeah. And then I'm going to do the snare. That's going to be L5, which is going to be input 7. That's great. That's the rack tom, which is going to be L5. That's going to need to come out of. There we go. Sorry, it was actually R6. And that will mean that the rack tom 2 trigger needs to come out of L7, which is going to be input 9. And you can see we're nearly running out of inputs here, but I do have enough to map this distortion effect. So this is a little bit trickier. If I start wiggling this effect control and navigate to the effect menu, I've got that distortion effect set up on effects 2. So if I go into effects 2 and the menu for this, so you can see this is where I've got that amp sim tube thing happening. If I scroll all the way to the bottom of this menu, here's where I can find the individual out setting for that effect, or you could do this with the reverb, but I'm going to do it with that distortion. And I'm going to map that to my final individual output, which is going to be R8. So now I want to get that phone audio in there. And this is just going to be a case of going into the Bluetooth audio menu, going to Bluetooth out. And here you can see that we don't want to route this to an individual output because those are all being occupied by everything else now. What I can do is leave that set to off, which is going to mean that my iPhone audio or anything coming over a Bluetooth stream is going to be coming in on those inputs 1 and 2, the first one. So slightly confusing why I've left those to the end and left those till last, but hopefully that makes sense now. It's because I've done all of our actual drums first and then our backing track audio here. But of course, this means we now have to be careful because I haven't routed out that reverb to its own separate output. If I turn up the reverb, that will come out of inputs 1 and 2, which means that if I was to start playing with the reverb up, just that reverb signal would also end up getting mixed with the Bluetooth audio. So you've got to be quite careful about that if you choose to do that, and just make sure that everything is basically routing where you want it to, and that there's nothing accidentally now coming out of inputs 1 and 2. So something else pretty sneaky that I have just realized, I've got that iPhone audio track where I've got inputs 1 and 2 isolated. If I play the snare, you can see that my snare trigger is still coming out of inputs 1 and 2, even though I've routed it out of its own separate output. And the reason why that is happening is because I also haven't specified this effect through setting, and you actually need to do that for everything that's being routed individually as well, which is kind of annoying. So you can see my snare is routed correctly to individual out L5, but above that you've got these EQ, effect through, and what you need to do is go into this effect through menu and navigate to where it says main out. I would turn that off, and USB out 1 and 2, and make sure that that is off. And now the snare trigger will be routing to its own channel and not ending up bleeding onto this iPhone audio track here. So you can see now I've only got that coming through on the correct snare trig channel and not this. iPhone one at the bottom. The other thing that we need to do before we get on with recording is in these individual out settings, you've got this individual out volume. So I'm going to turn that up. But now you can see obviously what I'm recording into Logic is coming in very hot. So I'm going to set the individual output volume for my kick at around 50. Or maybe a bit lower, 45. You can see now, just so we're getting good recording levels, I'm going to do the same thing with the snare trig. Do the racked on 1, so do the racked on 2. Now I'm going to grab that distortion effects. Right, I'm not going to lie, I've just spent a little bit of a while messing around trying to sort out some issues that I've been having. When I had the output device in Logic also set to the EAD, for some reason I was getting some sort of weird recording feedback loop. I think that had something to do with the menu, USB audio and the USB audio out options and stuff going on in here, like if these are routed to the main out or the USB out 1 and 2 as well, that can create a feedback loop where I'm routing. So there's quite a lot as soon as you start using this in that way. Got to be quite careful with all of the settings in the module for everything and where it's routing. I've connected my phone over Bluetooth and I'm going to start playing a track from my sampling account that hasn't got any drums in it. Let's try that again. I'm going to hit record in Logic. I'm going to hit play on my backing track on my phone and let's see what we end up with here. If you can't be dealing with any of this USB audio routing faff, you can also just record directly onto an SD card or USB thumb drive, and this is one of the uses of that USB-A port and why it's there. When you first insert a USB stick or an SD card into the EAD50, it's going to say invalid SD card or invalid USB device. Scroll down to the file menu here, and in this menu scroll down to where it says external memory. In here you'll need to format your USB stick or SD card via the EAD itself, otherwise it won't recognise. After you've formatted your USB stick or your SD card, you should then be able to use it with the recorder and to import or export samples with. Although one thing to be aware of with the SD card, I originally tried to use a high-speed SDHX and the EAD50 just did not like that, so the one that I'm using is an SDHC card. Someone on my last video asked if it was possible to record multi-track files using this USB stick method and record all the individual channels onto the USB thumb drive like we're doing with the audio interface method. Unfortunately, you cannot use the USB stick recording method as a multi-track recorder. Even though if you go into the recorder settings, and I can see that there are these options to include the USB outputs 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 7 and 8 and so on, all I seem to be getting out of it is a single stereo file that includes everything on it together. So it's basically behaving like the EAD10. However, it is still pretty handy just to be able to shove a USB stick or an SD card into the back of this thing and then immediately start recording. And that's still not all. There is one more recording method with this which also ties into live sound setup, and that is using the good old-fashioned analog outputs on the back. So the USB audio interface feature for recording, I think it's amazing that the EAD50 has got that in and it's really useful, but I think that is typically only going to be useful to solo drummers, people in this situation like I've been using this, where you're at home recording by yourself, or all you need to record is just your drums to a backing track. Great for people making social media, drumming videos and stuff like that. Where I I think this falls down, and the limitation of it is obviously when you try and record the EAD50 with a full band, or if you need to record your drums with a band. Problem with the EAD50 is you haven't really got that many inputs. You do only have 5 mic inputs, which is going to be enough for your drums, but not for everybody else in your band if you wanted to record it all with the EAD50 as your USB audio interface. The other thing is the limitation to 44.1 kilohertz, where if you go analog out, you're not going to have that same limitation. You also won't be recording with any latency, as there'll be no latency over USB. If you plan on gigging with the EAD50, you're going to want to use the physical outputs. You could just use the main left and right out and just give your front of house sound engineer just all your drums on 2 cables, which I guess is part of the appeal of the EAD50. And I think that would be okay probably for most small gig situations. But I think there are going to be times where you'll need to give a front of house engineer a bit more control of your drums, and using the analog outputs will enable you to do that, and it will give them more control of your drum mix for a gig and front of house sound. You might be wondering, well, seeing as it's all TRS output jacks on the back of the EAD50, how do you connect that to pro sound gear, as that tends to all be XLR connections? And the answer to that is pretty simple. I've basically just built a little snug, and that basically consists of 4 of these little TRS to male XLR adapters, which are very short, and then daisy chained into that I've just got a regular XLR mic cable, and then you plug one end of that into the daisy chain, and then the other end just goes to your mixer. And then that means instead of using the USB audio, I can easily send all of the EAD50 signals to, say, a mixing desk or the recording desk that's got enough inputs to also handle the rest of the recording setup, and then you can easily redistribute those signals with 0 latency, of course, because it's all coming out analog and direct from the module, and then you can distribute those signals to a full band and give them all independent control as well. If you haven't seen it, check out my previous upload on this, where I went into a little bit of a breakdown about how I'm using the EAD50 in combination with the X32 to achieve this and what it's enabling us to do as a band. But there is one more cool little power user feature that I want to go over before I wrap this up. So I've got myself a MIDI cable here and a little MIDI interface, which is this little M Audio MIDI Sport 2 in, 2 out. I think these are discontinued, but if you need a MIDI interface, Behringer do one of these for about 20 quid, so they're not expensive. And I've got that connected over USB to my laptop, and I'm going to pop that into the MIDI out port on the back of the Yamaha EAD50, and I'm going to plug that into the MIDI in A port of this little MIDI interface. Now this is really cool because we can record MIDI out from the triggers, and if you use anything like Addictive Drums 2 or Superior Drummer or Get Good Drums, for example, you can basically record a real kit and record triggers for drum software like that, which I think is going to take this to the next level. So the thing about the method of using a SD card with samples loaded in for the trigger sounds, and even though I've created custom trigger sounds for my kick drum using sounds in AD2, when you're using drum software like this, you tend to be able to get a more realistic sound. Every time I hit this kick drum, it's going to play a slightly different sample. It's using something called Round Robin. There's a whole bunch of different recordings of this kick drum in here. So every time I hit it, you get a slight variation or a slightly different one. Because the EAD50 doesn't support that, what you're playing is just a single audio file over and over again. You can probably hear sometimes my kick or my snare or my triggers sound a little bit robotic because I'm just triggering that same sample repeatedly. And I think that that works well enough for the recording and in-ear monitoring situation. But I think leaving that as the final drum trigger sound, I think it doesn't sound great in all situations. So by recording the MIDI, we can then also tweak the trigger sound and get a more realistic dynamic out of things like that, or a more realistic response from the triggers. And then we can also customize and change that sound in the recording or production process later, which I think is insanely powerful. And just to show you how easy this is to do, if you've seen my previous video about using an electric kit in combination with Addictive Drums 2 and how to map an E kit to the right drums in here, it's exactly the same process using this system with the EAD50 and the triggers. So if I click on these 3 little lines at the top of AD2's user interface and I go to the MIDI mapping window, if I navigate to the kick channel and I hit learn, all I need to do is just go, and there we go. It just assigned my kick drum trigger to the kick drum in Addictive Drums 2. And I'm going to repeat that process with the main snare open hit. That's the snare assigned. I'm going to do tom 1 to my rack tom. I'm just going to pretend that this rack tom 2 trigger here is my floor tom. And there we go. Now all of my triggers are assigned to Addicted Drums 2. And then if I hit record, so here you can see this is that MIDI clip that I just recorded. You can see that the velocities have come out quite interestingly. And this is where you may need to fiddle a little bit by going into the mic trigger options, going into setting, going to your trigger in menu. In the triggers pad settings, you've got these minimum and maximum velocity settings. Now that affects the trigger that you hear, and it affects the sensitivity of the trigger when you're recording, but it does also affect the MIDI value that you end up recording out of this into something like Logic. So for example, my kick here, which is mapped to C1, so my maximum velocity on my kick is set to go out at its full value, which is 127, and you can see what that results in here is my kicks are just coming out with full velocity and like that. So I personally find that to be a bit much and a bit intense. I prefer my kick velocity with this plugin to be more around 100 or 110. And then also, I don't really want my kicks to have as much range to get to a minimum velocity of 1, because 1 is just so quiet that it's just basically not even there, like this. So I very rarely have a kick that's velocity is that low. For like a quieter ghost note kick, I might have that at like 50 or 60. When it comes to the snare trigger, that's a little bit different. I want the snare to have more dynamic range in it, because with the snare, especially when it comes to certain ghost note things, my ghost notes and stuff like that sometimes are down at these very low velocities, and then my loud snare accents are probably more up at, yeah, around 110, peaking into this orange color, but without becoming full bright red or that full velocity there. So on the snare trigger settings, I'm going to set my maximum velocity to something like 110, and I will leave the minimum velocity maybe down at something like 10. So toms, I don't tend to play quite as dynamically, but it is still nice to have some dynamic range if you're doing anything like a crescendo, like. Both my toms I'm going to set to have a minimum velocity of 30 or 40 or so, and a maximum velocity of 110. So there we go. Now you can see that my velocities are recording a bit more nicely. I might actually take the snare velocity down a bit. Now you can see that's doing quite a nice job of picking up my quieter ghost notes compared to my main snare accents. So I'm going to just hop over now to showing you what this is like in a full mix situation. What is the EAD50 like once you've recorded it and got it into a full mix? Well, I'm going to show you that now, and I believe this is the full, true, unlocked power level of the EAD50, or what makes it so incredibly awesome. So this is a recording that I did with my good pal Mole James Glazier on drums, and we recorded this live at our rehearsal studio. So you can hear it's a pretty good recording, but obviously dropped into a mix, there's some work that needs to be done, which is what's cool about this. We can now process these drums and bring them up to standard for a full mix like this, basically. So let me just solo the EAD50 mic on its own so you can hear what that's like. So this is the DSU50 mic capture, or the main EAD50 capture just by itself. I do also have the phone mic audio in here, so we can compare that to what we're getting from the DSU50 quickly. So actually using your phone mic audio and layering it in with this might not be a bad idea. It works kind of like an additional room mic, I guess. So let's hear what that's like with the two blended together. So now I'm going to add in the triggers. These are actually built-in trigger sounds, not the ones from Addicted Drums 2. So let's hear what those are like. Another bit with some more toms in it. You can hear there are some accidental kick triggers under the snare sometimes, but it would be easy enough to just go through and cut those out like that. So this track here is all the Addictive Drums 2 MIDI. What I've decided to do with this drums MIDI is actually get rid of all of the snare ghost notes, and I've only kept the main snare accents for the trigger sound. That way, all the ghost notes you hear are actually the real ones from the EAD50 mic, and then it's only the big accents that have the snare trigger layer on them, basically. So I just think that sounds a little bit better than trying to put trigger layers on the ghost notes as well. So let's add in Addictive Drums 2. So that's pretty cool, right? And let me just get rid of that. So we're only looking at these 3 tracks now. So this is sounding pretty good so far, but obviously you can hear that the drums, apart from the triggers, are a little bit quieter in the mix, and I want to get them up to level with the rest of the backing tracks. A quick trick that I'm going to do is on the DSU50 mic, I'm going to put K-Clip by Kazrog on this, and this is basically just the clipper. I'm going to set the ceiling to -0.1 dB, and now watch as I drive up this input gain. Basically, I can make the DSU50 mic louder in the mix and give it a bit of sort of drive or clipping saturation, and you'll notice that I never go over 0 on the meter and never actually clip digitally, if that makes sense, which means I can pretty much get this DSU50 mic as loud as I need it to be in the mix. Check this out. Just that move alone has kind of brought the whole mix together and kind of glued things together. What I could also do is group my drum tracks together, or create a summing stack, as Logic calls it, but this is basically a group. I'm going to put a second instance of Kazrog K-Clip on my whole drums bus and do essentially the same thing, but now drive all of those. Now I'm just going to take my output and turn that down to compensate, because that's gotten really loud. Possible to start putting EQ on the whole drums mix as well. Tape saturation or something like that on the drums as well, just to crunch them up a bit more. We could put a bit of compression on those drums. What about... Now I've got everything combined onto a full mix bus, so I can just do some kind of like master processing and EQ. I can just put a limiter on the master out and drive that up. I can give that some more drive into the clipper, and we can make this fucking stupidly loud. Let's set our output ceiling so it doesn't go over -1, and then just drive up the full mix into that L2 limiter. That might all be a little bit overly heavy and possibly too clipped and compressed, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what you can do with the EAD50 recordings once you've got them in a full mix. And yeah, this awesome thing about having Addictive Drums 2 in there. For a final mix process, it's kind of ridiculously efficient, or I think it is anyway, compared to trying to mix real drums. I can literally just get into my recording session and then unmute this Addictive Drums 2 track, and what that does for my drums mix is pretty much game changing, I think. I can change things like the voicing of the snare and stuff after the fact. Or things like linking that snare to a clap stack, for example, like this.
So that is absolutely fucking nuts, I think it's fair to say. I would like to go and actually make some music with this all now, and you should do that too. Bye.